In this video, we're going to talk about a topic that we've already addressed a few times, conditional sentences. A conditional sentence is a compound sentence in which the truth of one of the clauses, the consequent, is conditional on the truth of the other clause, the antecedent. In English, the antecedent is frequently introduced by if and the consequent by then, but stylistic variations are common. Conditional arguments are arguments contained in conditional sentences. So all three of these are examples of conditional sentences. If I study, then I will pass my math exam. Maisie will recover from mono, provided that she takes care of herself. You will never pass a math class if you don't do any homework. Even though they're all conditionals, you'll see that the language used to express them is each different. But we can see what they have in common when we first identify the antecedent in each claim, the bolded claim. I study is the antecedent of this first one. Maisie takes care of herself is the antecedent of the second. And you don't do any homework is the antecedent in the third. Now the way conditionals work is if the first thing obtains, then the second thing will obtain. The first thing is sufficient for the second thing to be the case. So let's look at the consequence, that second thing. So in this first case, if I study, then I will pass my math exam. The claim is a conditional because passing your math exam is conditional on you studying. Recovering from mono is conditional on you taking care of yourself. And passing a math class, not passing a math class, is conditional on you not doing any homework. Now, it's important to notice that we're not saying the only way, for example, you could never pass a math class is not doing any homework. You could also not be a student, or be a student but never come to school. Those are other ways in which you'll never pass a math class. But the claim is that the antecedent provides a sufficient condition, is the term used in logic and philosophy, for not passing a math class. Just as in this case, studying is a sufficient condition for passing a math class. If you do this, then this will happen, even though there are other means by which this might come about. For the most part in this chapter, we'll focus on instances of conditional sentences in the simple if-then form. They're just easy to work with. But you should keep in mind when you're assessing arguments out in the real world that the expression of conditionals isn't always so neat as the if-then form. In fact, more often than not, you'll have to kind of work to find the conditionals in language in a less obvious fashion than if they're presented with the if-then form. For the most part, we're also going to focus on conditionals as truth-functional material conditionals. What does that mean? Well, there's a variety of different ways in which we can understand what we mean when we write or utter a conditional sentence. One of the meanings is a type, the material conditional. It's probably the most common thing we're going for, and there's certain things we can do with material conditional understanding, so that's what we're going to focus on. A material conditional is a conditional that is false only when its antecedent is true and its conclusion is false. Remember, material conditionals are compound sentences, so the sentence as a whole is going to have a truth value, but so will each of the little pieces. So the only time a material conditional is false is when the antecedent is true and the conclusion is false. We're going to look at examples which will make clear what that means if it's not obvious right now. The relationship between the antecedent and the consequent in a material conditional is truth-functional, meaning that the truth of the conditional sentence is determined completely by, that is a function of, the truth of its component sentences. So this is another case where looking at form alone, if we've got the sentence, if X, then Y, if that sentence is true, we know about the relationship between X and Y even though we don't know what x and y may be. Because we can tell whether or not a conditional is true purely in virtue of its form, if we have P stand for any old antecedent and Q for any old consequent, thus getting the sentence if P then Q, we can say what the truth conditions for any conditional sentence will be. What do we mean by truth conditions? The truth conditions are, well, unsurprisingly, the conditions under which something is true. So when we're trying to figure out under which conditions a conditional sentence is true, we are talking about under which circumstances the antecedent is true and which ones it's false, and same with the consequent. So how to read this little table here. This column, we've got our antecedent, P, and this column, we've got our consequent, Q. There's 4 different possibilities we can have for the truth values of each of these small parts. Either both the antecedent and the consequent can be true, the antecedent can be true and the consequent false, the antecedent false and the consequent true, or they can both be false. So what this table says is, according to the rules of sentential logic, when is a conditional sentence true and when is it false? Well, if you look here, you can see that when the antecedent is true and the consequent is true, the whole conditional is true. And that seems to make sense. So, for example, it says, if Lassie is a dog, then Lassie is an animal. Yep, your antecedent's true, your consequent's true, and the whole sentence is true. But when the antecedent is true and the conclusion is false, then the entire conditional sentence will be false. So, for example, if the claim was, if Lassie is a dog, then Lassie is a hamburger, that would be false. And that follows this pattern. We've got a true antecedent, but a false consequent. Note that this is in fact the only time, according to sentential logic, when a conditional will be false. When we get to these bottom 2 cases, where we've got false antecedents, it starts to seem kind of weird what the truth condition should be at all. And while it might be a matter of debate how to best interpret the truth conclusions of these sentences in English, according to the rules, according to the conventions of sentential logic, anytime you've got a false antecedent, you actually have a true conditional. But you're not going to have to worry about these bottom 2 so much. It's mostly the fact, the big important takeaway is the only time a conditional sentence is false is when the antecedent is true and the consequent is false. And that'll be relevant in the next video, where we'll be looking at some arguments that feature conditionals.